Okay, let's begin with a short meditation. Okay. For each activity that humans are involved in, there are non-physical intelligences that are available to support us. Very often that support is offered without our needing to ask for it. But there's a spiritual principle that relates to our free will that involves the notion that if you ask for something, more more support is available than would be the case if you didn't ask. So even if there's a relationship that's been established in the past, for instance, with a colleague or a teacher, for instance, and that relationship still exists in the inner world, and often such a being might be invisibly, if you will, supporting your life, your practice, and but knowing that this is happening, or at least being open to the idea, and actively inviting beings of that sort to engage you in different ways, enhances, it kind of opens that doorway more and allows for greater participation. There's two main kinds, although there's others as well, but the two main kinds of beings are those that are also part of the human kingdom and may or may not be currently in incarnation. And each person on the spiritual path has a kind of team, you might say, of support beings of various sorts. And some of them are humans. Some of them may even be sort of part of our larger spiritual family. And others are even more close at the moment, in the sense that they may be a relative that has passed over, or they may be, as I suggested, part of a larger spiritual lineage that we're part of. Also, another class of beings are those that are part of the archangelic kingdoms. And there's a variety of beings. In a sense, for every conceivable human activity, there are angelic presences that are available to support that activity. So if you, for instance, are traveling, there are beings that can help you with that, invisible intelligences that can help orchestrate your journey, for instance. So whether you're asking for healing, for support in your education, in your relationships, in parenting, there's all kinds of intelligences that specialize in these different areas. And there are certainly those that support spiritual practice. So when it comes to different aspects of our path, say, for instance, meditation, it can be very useful, although we don't want to necessarily get the idea that something obvious and very magical and profound is going to suddenly happen if we invite spiritual intelligences to support our practice. Sometimes that can happen, but normally it's a subtler influence, but it's significant. It's powerful to invite such beings to, and it can simply be one way to go about this is to just make this a regular part of our practice when we sit down. We can acknowledge our participation in the spiritual path. We can invoke whatever sense that we've developed of being part of some kind of larger community or lineage. And we can invoke specific beings that we may already be aware of, or at least consciously feel attracted to. We may feel that we're Christian or Hindu or Buddhist, and there's particular individuals within those lineages or spiritual communities that we feel somehow just intuitively connected to, or we may in fact feel a more conscious experience of relationship to. So at the beginning of a meditation, for instance, we can just take a moment to remember those connections and invite them in, sort of reaffirm our invitation for them to support our spiritual practice in whatever ways are best for us. Sometimes people will also invoke a practice like that at other times of the day, going to sleep at night. If you're involved in some kind of activity like spiritual education or healing work or some other form of spiritual service, that would be a good time to invoke our support network and strengthen their by consciously acknowledging them and affirming our cooperation and openness to inspiration and guidance, even if we're not able to consciously understand and experience that that's happening. If we have some intuitive faith that that's so, we can work with that and invoke that. And it really, a lot of the times, isn't based at all on having a clear and conscious experience of knowing that that's happening, experientially, seeing beings or communicating with them. Certainly that happens, but it's not necessary that be an aspect of how it works. It can simply be an invocation of presence and support and cooperation. We've been speaking about mind and body, and the way that the two most basic forms of spiritual practice reflect the distinction of mind and body. In one sense, it's kind of an active and outer versus an inner and contemplative distinction. So for instance, in the Hindu tradition, this basic distinction in terms of spiritual practice is often made between karma yoga and, well, what we'll call, if we're going to stay with the Sanskrit terms, could be called dhyana yoga, dhyana meaning meditation. So the basic, there's a lot of different styles of each. So we can talk about that too, which we've also touched upon. But the basic distinction that's very useful for us to keep in mind is that we want to develop and sustain and deepen practices in both of these areas to maintain a balance, because we're cultivating a spiritual path that is a balance between these basic aspects of our nature. When we've talked, for instance, about the notion of an ascending path, that's a way of saying that there can be sort of leanings in a spiritual path where we are more inclined to favor the mind, the subjective, the internal, and to downplay the importance of the physical. Sometimes we may lean in the opposite direction and favor the physical aspect of our nature, the feeling nature, activity, and so on, and kind of downplay the mind. In a more balanced and excuse me, complete whole path. We really want to cultivate both aspects, because they're not only both aspects of human nature, but they're really very deeply interdependent. And to have a truly deep awakening about our true nature, if we favor too much one aspect of our nature, we're kind of approaching the whole thing in a biased way, and our enlightenment will reflect that bias. There'll be kind of a excessive leaning in one direction. In a sense, our very perception of reality will be lopsided, and our ability to actualize enlightenment in ourselves and in the world will be lopsided. So it's not just, for me, a personal bias, like, well, there's this way and there's this way, and then there's putting them together. It's more kind of the case, you might say, that I'm suggesting is that this is really an understanding of spirituality that honors our full human nature, and the deeper nature of what enlightenment really is, the deeper truth that we're realizing. It requires not only a balanced development of our mind and body, but eventually a deepening, direct, intuitive appreciation of the profound way in which mind and body are interdependent with each other. They define each other, you might say. One can't really exist without the other. They're completely interdependent realities, like yin and yang. So far we've been kind of emphasizing the meditation side, and part of the reason for that is because the part of the spiritual path that's most often focused on in a sense in society, like in a sense ordinary culture, as well as the traditional spiritual systems, religions in the world, ultimately kind of tend to emphasize the karma yoga aspect, that part of the spiritual path that has to do with cultivating spiritual qualities in the midst of day-to-day life. And that's very important, and we actually will spend a fair amount of time with that. That's one of the reasons that so far I've been emphasizing meditation, is because it's the weaker side in our current human culture. There's certainly a lot of traditions all over the world. Virtually everywhere there are traditions that teach meditation as an important part of the spiritual path, but they're usually less popular, in a sense that they're more esoteric or mystical aspects, and sometimes these orders are seen as even heretical and are repressed or persecuted by the mainstream traditions in whatever region that they exist in. So that's one of the wonderful and powerful things that's happening in our times, is around the world these more esoteric and mystical traditions are, in a sense, being allowed to flourish in areas where they haven't in the past, especially in Western cultures. There's always been certain versions, like you could become a monk and go into a monastery, a Christian monastery, let's say. But it wasn't really something that was as accessible to people who weren't becoming a monk or a nun. And even then, the knowledge of inner mysticism was inconsistent. Some places it was very well developed, and in other areas you could join a monastery and have very little exposure to deep understanding of mysticism. It's essentially just a place for people to continue being karma yogis at best, without really gaining any kind of deeper understanding of the meditative aspect of the path. One of the questions that comes up all the time is why why necessarily engage in both of these practices? Like some people will argue, well, can I just have a good meditation practice and that will enlighten me and that'll just sort of carry over by itself into the rest of my life, so I don't really need to think about that. It'll just, happen naturally. And actually, there's a certain truth to that will happen. And if you want, you don't necessarily have to dwell on or put some conscious effort into doing that. It will kind of happen by itself. It's also true that the meditation side doesn't need to be emphasized or included at all. You could just focus on the karma yoga side. However you go about that, the most common method these days is the approach of working with spiritual qualities. That's pretty universal. Some people will bring other practices into the context, like for instance, somebody might cultivate the ability to pray constantly throughout the day, or the version of that is say like mantra recitation, where you can keep a mantra going all day long. Ultimately, you can kind of generate enough continuity and depth in the practice of, say, a mantra where it'll even go through the night and throughout your dreams and so on. The mantra will still be going. And in a sense, that one form of that is kind of a more devotional type of practice, where if your approach to the mantra or prayer is in relationship to a deity, for instance, then that kind of brings a stronger devotional or bhakti, to use the Hindu term. But more often, it seems these days, we find that people are attracted most to concepts like bringing mindfulness into day-to-day life. And in the context of that mindfulness, often cultivating other qualities as well. And so the question often comes up, well, isn't that enough? Like, why bother with the meditation piece of that? There's actually quite a few different aspects to that discussion. And so we won't go into all of the details right now of the different points of view that help to illuminate that. But one of the most essential, at the heart of the whole thing, is that when we engage in a spiritual practice, there's really, in a sense, two main dimensions to that practice. And one or both may be in evidence at any given time. One of those dimensions is the reality that we think about this practice. It's like when we say practice an instrument, practice the piano. There's performances and there's practice. So when we kind of use the word spiritual practice, an aspect of what that can carry for us is a sense that it's a means to an end. It becomes part of a story for us that there's some type of way of being, some state of consciousness that we'd like to attain, and the practice is a method to attain that. The other aspect of spiritual practice is that it can be an expression of experiencing, actualizing the state that we wish to cultivate in that moment, so that we reduce the sense of it being a method or a means to an end, a process, and we cultivate and open more deeply to the reality that we already are in attunement with this state that we're seeking, and we keep actualizing that deeper and deeper, and we release the sense of there being a gap between where we are and that state, and we kind of try to slip into being more in that state and deepening it in that way. And ultimately, that practice culminates in a full experience, that where the sensation of a method falls away completely. Commonly, people also, again, this is another polarity, and very often people kind of lean one way or the other. There's certainly whole camps traditionally and in the world today, of course, that that view the latter, the sort of be that reality now kind of point of view, as the only true way, and that if you think in terms of method, that's an obstacle. You're actually engaging in delusion and you're creating obstacles for yourself. And then, of course, there's the other camp that leans the other way, and there's arguments from that side as well. And long story short, my view is that both of these truths are important, and each of them makes a powerful contribution to our understanding of awakening. And that there's a way to kind of, again, to integrate these two into a practice. And by integrating, for instance, the sense that can be a downside of the progressive and developmental and progress path, the sense that that can kind of create a feeling of separation between us and our true nature, between enlightenment and us, and so on, that can be reduced to a minimum and kind of offset. When you're engaged in a spiritual practice, for instance, you really want to drop any specific sense of a goal, except for something that's much more intimately a part of your immediate experience and just open to a kind of gentle moment-to-moment deepening. And so any kind of overt awareness of I'm trying to become enlightened and when will I become enlightened, you can kind of get way out of balance there and fill your mind with distractions about the process of enlightenment, the goal, am I enlightened yet, all these kinds of things. We want to just calm that down, and so that's bringing in that other influence of kind of bringing it more into the moment, making it but there's nonetheless, until one has truly gotten to a somewhat more advanced stage, it's not really possible to sort of slip over the line into a place where you've arrived and you're settled into a true, authentic experience of your true nature. My experience is that when people try to do that prematurely, it tends to lead to a variety of potential negative side effects, like becoming foggy, becoming kind of even kind of spaced out. And in other words, there's a potential to get into spaces where you think that you're settled into experiencing your true nature, but you're not. There's still subtle veils in between you and that, and you're fooling yourself. And if you have a more kind of like refined psychological understanding of the process of working your way into that state, then you will have a clearer and more realistic understanding of where you're at in that process and whether it's really time to sort of shift into that mode and rest in that state, so that you don't fool yourself and end up in a sort of a middle-ish state that's not really it's not really where you want to be, and it's not a true understanding of who you are. So in the spirit of honoring both of these points of view, we'll talk about both of them and how to kind of bring them both, in the sense, into our practice at all stages. But when we're talking about why to meditate, in a sense, we could talk about it from both points of view. One way to talk about why to meditate is because, well, let's talk about it first from the arriving perspective, like the point of view that you already are the Tao, you already are Buddha nature, you already are Brahman. There's an interesting teaching from the Zen tradition, the Soto Zen tradition, where Dogen, the Japanese founder of Soto Zen, was very much at one point in his life kind of possessed with the question of why, if we're already intrinsically Buddhas, Christs, one with the Tao, why do we have to work at experiencing that if it's just the true nature of how things are? What's all this practice about? Why work at this? And this became kind of a spiritual puzzle for him that he couldn't stop thinking about. He actually was already making substantial progress on the path. I think he'd been practicing for at least 10 years at this point as a full-time passion, and he had had some deep awakenings and was making significant progress. And then this spiritual conundrum kind of possessed him. So it became a kind of natural koan, and he stayed with that for some time. And through that, he had another level of awakening and kind of deeply intuitively realized the sort of solution, if you will. And at a very profound level, the solution to spiritual riddles like this, yes, exactly, it was like a personal or naturally arising koan. The solution to a deep riddle like this is ultimately something that's difficult to put into words, but the way Dogen found to express his solution is, he said, he came up with this phrase that's often kind of written with it's like practice / enlightenment. Practice enlightenment is how it's often conveyed. And what Dogen meant by this phrase was, one way to look at the nature of practice is that from a certain point of view, it's not that we necessarily practice to attain enlightenment. We practice because it's what human beings do as their enlightenment actualizes. As we actualize enlightenment, it takes the form of practice. That's what, in the same way that humans naturally eat and sleep, we also, as we're awakening, naturally practice. It's just what we do. And in that sense, the way Dogen talked about it was, so we can just say that practice is enlightenment. Enlightenment is practice. So enlightenment is a state of consciousness, but on the human physical level, it looks like practice as it's actualizing. That's just what we do. So that's a powerful way to kind of collapse that distinction, to understand that there's a more profound way to look at it, where it's not such a radical distinction, like there's the practice as the method, and then we try to arrive at a goal. It's a deep, intimate fusing of the reality of practice as enlightenment. Let's see. Yes. Being there while getting there. Climbing up from below while swooping down from above. Yes, I like both of those. So the other side of the truth is that on a relative level, we do have a sensation that we can engage in practice, especially during moments in our path where we don't really feel that sense of having arrived. We don't feel. Dogen emphasized the practice that he had learned when he was in China, that he termed shikantaza in Japanese, which means just sitting, basically. And this is his way of trying to encapsulate the spirit of practice enlightenment in a practice, where he described a way of just sitting. But generally, just sitting, shikantaza, is considered a more advanced practice. You're usually given other practices first. This is the same in other traditions, like Hindu traditions and Raja Yoga, in the Dzogchen teachings, and other forms of teachings in Tibetan Buddhism, like the Lam Rim teachings. There are other stages. One of the ways we've been talking about it is there's a kind of traditional stage, a tantric stage, and a non-dual stage. And so this approach, the practice enlightenment full collapse, where there's no distinction between the two, it kind of more is the non-dual stage, and it's it's powerful to understand that and work with that principle at all stages, but it's not going to come to its full realization for us, something that we deeply and directly experience until a more advanced stage. In the meantime, there needs to be some kind of willingness to participate in a sense that the practice has a kind of value to heal, to transform, to purify, to illuminate. All of these words, which ultimately are linked to time, they express some kind of process. So as we embrace this reality that it's inevitable that an aspect of our human experience of spiritual awakening has a time aspect to it, there's practice, there's stages, there's then that will necessarily mean that we'll also be engaged with concepts like what is the most useful practice for me to do at a particular stage, or even in addressing the basic question of why to practice at all, whether it's more outer practices like karma yoga or inner practices like meditation. We can go right at the heart of that question and say, from a relative point of view, in terms of achieving something, why practice at all? Is there really a difference between just going about our lives without even thinking about it and gradually maturing and gaining wisdom and the quality of our life improves? Is it possible, like in a sense we could just say, is it possible that all of this is kind of much ado about nothing, that we do all these things, but it would have happened anyway? That if I had just taken all this practice out of my life, I still would have grown and just become a more enlightened, more mature person. Well, many of us have already done enough practice where we've noticed that it just seems to us like that's not true. Introducing practice into our lives made a noticeable difference. The other thing that we tend to notice, for instance, is that there are many, many examples, thousands of examples, really. If we look all across the world, cultures, and back through history, there's thousands of examples of people who have achieved very profound levels of spiritual development. And we almost never find instances where that's happened without a conscious form of practice in their lives. And in the rare cases where there was very little or no apparent conscious practice, the argument can be made, I think, intuitively, it's quite obvious, that practice happened for those people in previous lives. So they're experiencing the karmic momentum of the fruits of often centuries of practice, where in this life something miraculous might have happened very suddenly. It's said, for instance, that it wasn't entirely uncommon for people to, say, go for the first time to hear the Buddha speak, and they would suddenly just have self-realization and end up in nirvana, in a state of nirvana, just from attending his talk. Now, from one level, we could say, wow, that Buddha's presence must have been spectacular, that could happen. Well, we don't want to detract from the power of the Buddha's presence. He certainly had a role in helping that person to awaken, but what we're missing is realizing that there was already a tremendous foundation of spiritual practice. In fact, I would argue that if somebody was ready to go right into samadhi, sahaja samadhi, nirvana, self-realization, with a trigger as little as hearing a talk from a great soul like the Buddha, they must have already been there. They must have already. There wasn't some big gap that was bridged just by that talk. The talk was simply a trigger. So even in these instances where we hear of rare cases where people attain self-realization apparently effortlessly without practice, it's still, to my mind, a product of centuries, if not millennia, of spiritual practice in previous lives. So there's a great deal of practical and intuitive wisdom, in my opinion, that's been developed in traditions for thousands of years, that practice makes it quite a significant difference. Yogananda made an interesting argument, he says that in his tradition it's taught that if you didn't do any spiritual practice and you were an average human being, it would take a very long time, actually quite a long time, to achieve self-realization. And that by doing Kriya Yoga, or this specific kind of spiritual practice, and I'm certain that this applies to any authentic practice, that the acceleration isn't, let's say, just say twofold, like you get there in half the amount of time or something. It's more like hundreds of fold. You're dramatically accelerating the rate of your awakening. This is actually a wonderful and vast topic, the whole question of like the essence of spiritual practice. I don't want to take too much time today to go into that, but it's actually something that gets right at the heart of the nature of being a human being. Briefly, I'll just mention that in my experience, the human kingdom isn't a kingdom that just randomly arose in samsara through, just natural evolution and samsaric, processes. Just, well, look, humans arose. The human kingdom was specifically designed the way that it is. A lot of these basic factors, like the types of bodies that we have, the fact that we have the type of energy body that we have with 7 chakras, the fact that we have self-awareness and intentionality, the fact that we reincarnate, and the way that reincarnation takes place. All of these are part of a very specific design that was orchestrated by greater intelligences to supply to individuals, spiritual beings, the opportunity to have a very accelerated form of spiritual evolution. So even when people aren't doing spiritual practice, by virtue of incarnating in the human kingdom, their spiritual growth is actually fairly accelerated. They're growing a lot faster than many other forms of life. But it's a workout. It's very difficult here in many ways, and there's a lot of ups and downs. It takes many lives to do it. And all of that seems like a long time and a great sort of drudgery sometimes, and we're sort of burdened with the difficulty of it all. But relative to other types of spiritual intelligences, it's actually quite accelerated. And then as we get more mature, as we go through many lives, we start to figure out what's going on. And essentially that's when spiritual practice kicks in. It's basically a form of deciding to consciously cooperate with the curriculum of what's already happening, which is a process of spiritual maturation through experience and reflection. So at that point, the rate of awakening happens even faster. Generally, it's not uncommon for it just to take a handful of lifetimes to go from first becoming interested in spirituality and engaging in the path. As long as one doesn't get sidetracked too much, it can be a matter of a handful of lifetimes to have a significant level of awakening, even achieve liberation. It's more common for it to take a few more lives than that, but it's possible sometimes for it to be just a few. This is very, very accelerated, and it's because of spiritual practice. At the heart of understanding why that's the case, we could say that part of the reason that human beings reincarnate is when you come down into a physical body, relative to other realms of experience, it's pretty dense here. And one of the most immediate implications of the sort of heaviness, if you will, of human incarnation is that we forget where we came from. The dimension of reality, or the soul realm, you might say, from which we came into incarnation. we forget all about that. So we forget why we incarnated, we forget our incarnational history, we forget what kind of a being we were before we became a human being. All of that's part of our soul knowledge. There's a deeper part of our nature that understands or remembers all of that. And we generally forget that when we incarnate. Subsequently, we're not super clear about what we're doing here, and we tend to just identify with our bodies and with the personality that develops through our participation in culture around us. We take on those values. And then, in order to gain spiritual wisdom from that, we have to eventually kind of reflect on how did all that go? How did that work out? But for many people, it means that we end up doing most of that work of reflecting on it when we leave incarnation. That's why so often we hear from people who have had near-death experiences that they have a life review. That's an extensive part of the process of what happens after incarnation, because when you're in human incarnation, the balance between mind and body is very skewed towards the body. Even people who we think of as very mentally developed, like intellectuals, scholars, and so on, scientists, and still, in an interesting sort of way, these people are actually still kind of skewed towards the body side, because the preoccupation of their mind is generally towards more physical things. If a person's a scholar of, say, history, they're still studying physical events, the events that transpire in cultures, politics, all of that stuff. The true, deeper understanding of mind is it's the part of us that can step back from all of that much more objectively. And spiritually awakened mind then evaluates what's happening in our physical lives and in our personalities through the lens of spiritual values. If you get up in the morning with the intention of being more patient than you were the day before, and you affirm that intention, then you can stop in the middle of the day and say to yourself, how am I doing? Just reflect on, in the light of the principle of patience, how am I doing? In a specific moment, you can reflect on it. At the end of the day, you can review the day and say, oh, so how did I do today? I had the intention to be more patient. How did that go? Those times when I remembered to be more patient, how did I feel? How did my work go? How did conversations go? Those times when I forgot to be patient, how did that go? And by reflecting on that consciously, we're actually accelerating the rate at which we learn to be more patient. Not because we're necessarily taking patience as like a moral imperative where we're a bad person if we're not more patient, and when we think about it, when we reflect on it, we beat ourselves up and say, oh, you were impatient again, terrible you. A purer, more soulful, more heartful kind of reflection is to just accept ourselves the way we are, but also recognize that when I act impatiently, I suffer more and other people suffer more. When I'm more patient, it's less so. And I value happiness. I value peace. I'm going to have that more the more patient I am. So that's why I do this. And I'm just going to kind of face the reality of how well am I doing in this whole learning process of becoming more content, more loving, more patient, more equanimous, more accepting, etc. It's a basic part of life that's what we're all doing. Even the average human being knows that there's some kind of value in being a little more civilized, a little more virtuous. The average person isn't deeply committed to that. That's secondary. It's sort of like the average person's basic life philosophy is, I want to get what I want out of life. I'm going to do that in a dualistic kind of way where there's things that I want to experience and things that I want to acquire. And my spiritual values are kind of there in the background to just say, let's do this in a somewhat civilized way. I'll basically be a somewhat selfish person that thinks that I'm going to be happy from just getting what I want out of life in that way. And my spiritual values are kind of in the background saying, well, don't be too aggressive and exploitive and nasty and dishonest to other people while you're doing that. Try to be civilized about it. And that's where a fair percentage of humanity is operating from. Some are even less than that. They just think, well, I'm just going to follow my self-interest and I'm not even going to try to be very civilized about it. So we have that type too. Then we have people in a third stage of spiritual development where they're saying, well, I think they're both important, kind of equally. And so I want to be happy by doing the kind of things that make an ordinary person happy. But there's also more meaning to life than that. I want to have love in my life. I want to be selfless. I want to make a positive contribution to the world. So that person is kind of in a middle phase. Then there's a fourth type of human being they're tipping the other way now. They still have plenty of human self-interest. They still have this belief that real happiness is from, a kind of dualistic, personality-centered value system. But that's fading, and they're kind of losing interest in that, and it's there enough so that they have to acknowledge it and accept that and give space in their life for that. But the other part's becoming much more dominant, to varying degrees. It can be mildly dominant to very dominant, where that part is geared towards saying, no, the real deeper satisfaction in life is spiritual. It comes from positive values of cooperation and service, love and kindness, and deep spiritual contentment. Being a kind of simpler being that increasingly is looking for less and less from the world and from others, and is more a source of positivity, of love, of enlightenment in the world. And of course, there's a whole spectrum there. So in a sense, we could say there's kind of 5 basic types of human beings. And it's really, those 5 types are an expression of the degree of these 2 ingredients, how they're mixed. Is it very much dominantly towards just pure self-interest? Is it kind of in the middle, a relative balance? Is it very profoundly leaning towards deeply spiritual values? Those are the 3 kind of basic, the 2 poles in the middle. And then there's a sort of intermediate stage between each of those, where there's those that kind of lean pretty much towards selfishness, but they have some values, and those that lean pretty significantly towards spiritual values. But there's, of course, remnant, normal human desires and interests. The vast majority of people on the spiritual path are kind of in that 4th group of they kind of lean towards the spiritual values, but there's still a humanness there that they have to live with and acknowledge and accept and gradually transform and heal and integrate. Generally, sometime around the middle to the 3rd to the 4th stage is where people often become interested in spiritual practice, because on a practical level, it's kind of like, once you start to figure out what's going on, once you realize that spirituality is what you've ultimately been looking for all along, it's the true solution to your suffering. It's the true way to pursue happiness. Not because a deity has told us so and that we'll only get into heaven if we do it this way, but simply it's just the nature of reality. It's to operate from a more dualistic point of view, where we think of ourselves as separate from the world, separate from each other, and operate out of a sense of lack, out of a sense of something's missing in me, and I can fill it by getting more money, by eating, by having sex, by becoming famous. Even small things like just, watching TV. Well, I'm a little discontented right now. What is it that I need? I think I'll watch some television. These are just all the infinite ways that ordinarily human beings operate. We all have these parts to ourselves. And what happens in the spiritual path is we gradually realize that's not really been working that well. And also, even to the extent that there are times where temporarily I can be happy from that, it's kind of unreliable. It can go away fairly readily. And also, I'm discovering that there's a quality of happiness that I get through deep embrace of spiritual values that's somehow ultimately more satisfying, so that even when the more worldly approach is working, it just is I'm starting to realize the other's still deeper. There's a more complete kind of happiness, more profound kind of happiness. How often does anybody try to make the case when they're selling you a product that you'll have eternal bliss from buying this product? Nobody can make that case. There's no human experience that gives you eternal bliss. It's only through self-realization, God consciousness, awakening, that can happen. So at that stage, as people are figuring that out, that's often when the question of spiritual practice arises. People, in a sense, it's kind of like once you start to get clear what you want, then one of the things that inevitably happens is you look around and you notice there seems to be people around that already have more of this than I do. So then that reinforces a sense of this is real, this is something that I can do, and then of course the question then arises. You might want to ask them, how did you get to the stage you're at of this level of fulfillment? And then, just like any other human endeavor, you see somebody living in a house and you ask, how did you get that house? That looks nice. I've been renting. I think I'd rather own a house. How do you do that? It's just a normal kind of a normal thing. If we see that spirituality is possible, spiritual awakening is possible, the next question to ask is, how do you do that? And then the next question after that is, well, okay, if there's a method to achieve this awakening, the next question becomes, what's the most efficient way to do it? What would be the optimal rate? Now that I know that that's what I want, why should I waste my time? The fullest kind of happiness is something that I want as efficiently as possible. Of course, we need to learn to be patient about it and to settle into a daily, moment-to-moment deepening of our spirituality. So we don't want that striving, that yearning for deep awakening to become a distraction from the actual moment-to-moment experience of cultivating it. But it's okay to have that. In a sense, people often feel that, oh, that yearning, that aspiration, that striving to have spiritual awakening, to have spiritual evolution, is problematic. And in a sense, there's ways in which it can become problematic, but it's not really ultimately problematic until you're at the last step where you're ready to step off into complete self-realization, where there's no need to strive for it anymore because you've arrived. Until then, there's always a subtle and natural presence of yearning for that completion. And so part of our spirituality really is just acknowledging this is something that we want. And yes, that sounds dualistic. Yes, that sounds like just another desire. But this desire, this yearning, is fundamentally different than every other yearning, every other desire that we've had. Because this is the desire that will lead to the fulfillment of all desires. This is the one desire that will lead to the state of completion where all desires will fall away. No other desire will lead to that. And it's a necessary part of the path. In fact, gradually, one of the things that's happening is that the other desires will kind of living, in a sense, with that part of you that is spiritually aspiring. Gradually, the other desires will get converted. They'll watch what's happening. They'll say, oh, look, there's this part of me is causing me to meditate, When that's happening for a while, I used to just be a distraction. I wanted to think about other things. I'd rather have been doing other things. But I'm kind of getting into this. And that desire will transform. And gradually, that yearning for enlightenment will become stronger and stronger because all the other desires have been converted over to that. But it takes time for that to happen. It's not going to happen in a week or a month. But gradually, that desire will become compelling. And it also will tend to relax some. It'll be this steady stream leading us towards self-realization, but it'll also become kind of imbued with more contentment and more sense of patience about the process. And that will naturally just turn into part of what leads to it just arriving towards just being the state that we're in. So don't judge yourself for wanting to be awakened. And also, another context in which that can be the case is that people will very often, we hear teachings like the concept of bodhisattvahood in Buddhism, or of Christ consciousness, of the spirit of service. And so in that context, sometimes we'll judge ourselves and we'll say, isn't it kind of selfish to want to be in nirvana ourselves, to want to be liberated, to want to be free of suffering? So because this other ideal of being of service, of being selfless, of being loving, that sounds like, well, it's not about me. And so it's inappropriate for me to have this aspiration to want to be liberated. My personal response to that is, I don't really feel like we can authentically have compassion for another person who wants to be free of their own suffering unless we acknowledge that in ourselves, we accept that in ourselves, and we make that part of our path. Because ultimately what we have to offer other people is the wisdom and love that comes from our own enlightenment. And we can't really gain that as directly if we don't just embrace that process ourselves. Embrace wanting to be enlightened and engaging in a practice that brings about that enlightenment. And then our cup overflows. That's what we have to offer other people, is the love and the wisdom that comes from our own personal experience of fulfilling that in ourselves. Now, I'm not saying you have to wait. I'm not saying first you should just forget about service and focus on your own liberation first, and then later they can go hand in hand. They can be both aspects of the path simultaneously. I just feel that it's very important not to be at odds with that aspect of ourselves that would like to be more enlightened, that would like to be liberated, that would like to be, and that part, as it matures spiritually, will transform and will mature. It will take on what the Buddhists call a quality of bodhicitta, where it's sort of being channeled into and matured into a sense of collective, not just for myself, but for all beings. But the foundation for that, I feel like, the starting point is just acknowledging that we want to be free of suffering. That's a basic human experience, and that doesn't go away until a much more advanced stage. And so we want to harness that energy. We want to use that energy in a skillful way to accelerate our awakening. So once we've understood these basic foundational truths about our nature and about spirituality, and we've asked ourselves the question, or we've engaged in a process of saying, I think that there's probably some truth to this, or very much likely to be truth in this, or there is truth in this, depending on our level of experience. That leads to a kind of ongoing question of, like, how do I bring this about? How do I not only facilitate my own awakening, but perhaps participate in helping others to do the same? It's a natural, I think, and an important question to ask. But what's the most skillful, safe, and balanced and efficient way to do that? And the efficient part of that is just kind of natural. Why would you want to, if we're really looking at this as a process of, among other things, having to do with overcoming suffering, transforming and healing and awakening into a state that's freer of suffering and disease and conflict, why wouldn't we want to do that as efficiently as possible, as long as there's no negative side effects to that? And that's where the whole question of why, for instance, to meditate comes in. The argument that's been made in one form or another for thousands of years by great masters is this component is very important to the most accelerated version of awakening. In fact, many people would argue that it's the most powerful aspect of the path, because since we need to bring a certain measure of wakefulness and then upon the foundation of that awareness, other spiritual qualities like concentration and acceptance, equanimity and contentment, we're trying to intentionally cultivate these qualities. If we're trying to do that during day-to-day activity, it's going to be slower because we don't have enough awareness. We don't have as much, I should say, awareness to focus on both that and the activities that we're engaged in. So what happens when we meditate is we're essentially calming the body down, saying, let's be less active, less involved in the normal experience of being a body. And so then more awareness is left over to be more connected to the mind side of my nature. I can be more contemplative. That process, for instance, that in a sense we're engaged in when we leave incarnation, that's when we do a lot of the deep kind of reflecting on what happened now in that incarnation. In a sense, meditation is learning to die now instead of later. It's like saying, I'm going to take moments daily to be present to my life in a much more wakeful way and to reflect on what's happening, reflect on my nature, to reflect on my behavior, to just be mindful, conscious, and be with my life in a more awakened way. Instead of waiting to the end of my life where I just do a little bit of, the average person has some reflection, some mindfulness going on. But then there's a lot of details, a lot of depth and subtlety that hasn't really been seen that clearly. And so kind of do a whole nother level of it after you leave incarnation, hence the notion of a life review. In a sense, one aspect of a way to understand what's happening, whether we're conscious of it or not, is this process of being able to be awake and review and be reflective during our lives, to bring the mind aspect into greater connection with body, is enhanced dramatically, because normally we're just much more caught up in activity in our day-to-day lives. Meditation is a time where we just flip it the other way and say, I'm going to calm my body down and be much more present and conscious and reflective. And then that gradually spills back into our day-to-day lives and strengthens it a lot. And so it's almost like a feedback loop is happening there between activity and contemplation, and that really accelerates the illumination. Also, when we sit down to meditate, we can cultivate qualities, especially one of the most important qualities in addition to awareness is concentration. When we develop this ability to concentrate, we're essentially saying, well, this quality of being reflective and other qualities that support that, like equanimity and contentment, I'm going to use concentration to magnify that quality manyfold. I'm going to make it 10 times more powerful than it is during my normal day-to-day activity. And that really dramatically accelerates our spiritual awakening. And then when we go back to our day-to-day lives, we notice, well, I don't remember to be mindful a lot of the time. And then even when I am, I am not that concentrated out. It lasts for a minute or two, and then I forget. And even when I am, it's kind of like a mild mindfulness compared to my meditation. Well, that's still good, and that's going to grow, and our practice in our day-to-day lives is important and ultimately an integral part of the total awakening. But one of the things we notice is we get proficient at meditation, we notice, wow, there's just a lot more presence, a lot more awareness, a lot more concentration, a lot more equanimity, a lot more contentment when I'm meditating than in my day-to-day life. And that deepens our appreciation of how powerful meditation is and how significantly accelerates our growth, because it's in the context of that enhanced state of presence that two things are happening. One is that the rate at which we develop wisdom is accelerated enormously. And secondly, the quality of that presence and that wisdom is a growing light in our nature, and that light's illuminating the rest of our nature. It's illuminating our minds, our emotions, our motivations, and our physical body. And it's purifying and transforming them and changing them. So our character is changing. The elementals or thought forms that make up our character, they're all getting transformed faster. That's why as we get into some deeper states spiritually, it's not uncommon for interesting phenomena to start happening. We might start feeling like energies are moving around in our bodies. And then as soon as we get up from meditation, often it just stops. That's a sign right there of how powerful meditation is, that it can activate that transformation much more dramatically. Now, sometimes it will carry over into your day-to-day lives, this movement, but there's often a stage that some people more than others will enter into where there's what is often called Kundalini phenomena. This is just the activation of energies that express our growing awakening, that start to purify our karma, our elementals, our energies in our mind-body system. And generally, these happen in a much more accelerated way when we're meditating. We see that happening more and more, and that's a sign that this transformation is happening. So, interestingly, I'll just kind of plant a seed and then we'll take our break. When we talk about these notions like this willpower or effort that can be used in spiritual practice, the notion that it involves a sense of time, a story of awakening, that that part of that story is the notion of not only awakening, but that we're using our practice to accelerate that awakening. A common theme that underlies all of these different concepts or elements of this process of spiritual practice is time. Kind of saying time with like a capital T. Part of what spiritual practice really is it's an ability to harness time. And I mean that more, at least in a normal sense, on a psychological and spiritual level, that when you accelerate evolution, we're in a sense saying, I'm getting a handle on time. I'm going to inject time into my life so that things that would normally in nature by normal processes take a certain amount of time to take place, I'm going to put time into this so that it collapses it. I'm going to compress time, you might say. Literally become kind of a master of time. And that in a sense is part of what willpower is it's the capacity to transcend natural time and introduce spiritual time, which is why it accelerates. Love, awareness, and willpower, for instance, they're in a sense forms of time, and by cultivating them, our spiritual awakening accelerates. And essentially, let's say if we look at another type of spiritual event like a healing, somebody goes to a spiritual healer And something happens in relationship to that. Through that healer, other beings are often involved, and healing is facilitated. Now, the thing is that disease was caused by karma, and when that karma plays out, it's usual for that disease to heal naturally. So even, let's say, if a person had a cold, and let's say it was a kind of a difficult cold and was going to last 2 weeks, it's not uncommon that you could go to a spiritual healer. That person will lovingly flood that individual with etheric vitality, and now the cold only lasts for 5 days. They, in a sense, gave time to that person. They accelerated the rate of their healing. And that is essentially what the same thing is happening in spiritual awakening. In a sense, time is love. Love is time. When spiritual masters help people on the spiritual path, they're, in a sense, grace itself, transmission, initiation, is a transmission of time. It's a power of acceleration, of collapsing the distance between where you stand and where you seek to be. So, for instance, even just the act of explaining that self-realization is possible changes the game, because in a sense, we're wandering around through many lifetimes seeking something that we don't even know what it is. And we're going through all kinds, in a sense, we're just doing a lot of experimenting. We don't even know that we're experimenting. Moment to moment, we're just saying, oh, I think I want to do this. Deep down, what's really happening is we're looking for happiness. We're trying to figure out what will bring it. We're doing a lot of experimentation. If somebody comes along and says, look, at the rate that you're going, in about 3,000 more years, you're going to figure out something. It's that this is how you're going to want to be. This is what will give you the greatest happiness. You're going to eventually figure that out the way that you're doing it. But I'm going to tell you now that that's what you're looking for. And if you're right, which I think you are, some part of you is going to recognize the truth of what I'm saying, and that's going to really speed things up, because now you can experiment with that. And you wouldn't have figured out that idea for a few thousand more years if left on your own. So I'm introducing time. I'm going to give you a chunk of time. I'm going to give you 3,000 years of evolution. Now, you still actually have to play through some of the learning in there, but you get to do it in this awakened way where you're going to hold a larger context that says, yeah, other parts of me still think they don't want to do that. They want to play out of, but I'm going to simultaneously cultivate a bigger context that I can contain that in, where I actually understand where this is going. At least I'm pretty intuitively inclined to think that's true. We'll see. I'll experiment. And that larger context, which we're calling spiritual practice, if we do that in a balanced way, imbues all this other learning with, infuses it with an energy that accelerates even that level of it. And we still gain all that wisdom that we would have gotten if we had played out the 3,000 years of experience, but it gets accelerated how quickly it happens. So there's something very deep happening in spiritual practice that's very remarkable and wonderful. And meditation is a key part of that. It's a deep component of this whole science and art of accelerated evolution. Okay, so let's take our 10-minute break now, and then we'll come back and we'll have a meditation.
kysellä nyt ne on joku kilpikoodi. Kuinka laittaa? Kalla on eilen hoitanut kissat tällä päivällä. Saat olla 10 puhelimella, jos nyt laitan kaikki muut valmiiksi. Sitten ei saa.
Okay. Let's do a meditation now. This will be a little bit of a guided meditation, but it'll be kind of leaning more towards exploring the spirit of something more like Shikantaza that we were talking about earlier. Just kind of get a taste of that deepened more. Begin by settling in. And particularly being aware of your body. Just feeling your body as a whole. including an awareness of breathing. And feel as you breathe, tensions washing away, and your mind calming down. As your mind and body relax and open, you notice any places of tension or discomfort in your body. They may continue to let go, but if they don't, just accept them being there. If there's any preoccupations in your mind that don't seem to fade away, just become more spacious. Let them be there. Just contain them. Feel yourself gradually settling into being more and more present and content in the moment. Not needing anything to be different than it is. Just letting things be as they are. In your mind, in your body, in your life. In the world. Just sitting with everything. Being okay with things as they are. Be aware of everything. As thoughts arise, be aware. Sensations in your body, sounds in your environment, feelings. Just take it all in, let it be. You feel this sense of acceptance and contentment deepening. Gently, gradually deepening. If you become distracted, just bring your attention back to your body. And the feeling of just being present, being aware. Being at peace. If new layers of tension arise in your body, just be with them. Often just being with them, they'll melt. They'll relax. So slowly your mind and body keep relaxing, letting go. As you sit, you may be aware of thoughts and feelings that arise about yourself. These may arise as just a sort of background feeling of a general, almost invisible sense of self. And if that arises, notice that too, and just accept that. Be with that. And as you do, you continue to settle deeper and deeper into just being. If you find yourself becoming too distracted, you can choose a more concrete focus like your breath to anchor you again until you get more present and concentrated. And then you can relax into a more spacious presence again. And when you feel ready, open your eyes. So again, this is a form of practice that's kind of leans more towards the end of the spectrum of arriving. There is a state that we could call self-realization, where a full blossoming of that is integrated so much into your state of presence that a very vivid sensation of being whole, not needing anything to be any different than it is, not feeling the need to change anything for personal reasons. There is a sense of compassion that arises with that state, where there's a participation in collective awakening, if you will. But it doesn't arise so much out of a sense of urgency or personal incompleteness or anxiety or anything like that. It's more of a mysterious spilling over of your wholeness into participating in others, the awakening of others. So as personal desire completes in self-realization, in awakening, love remains. Love remains as the transformation of that desire into a selfless participation in collective awakening. So this is one kind of what I often call essence practices. There's a variety of ways that one can do that. Our attention can be subtly directed in different directions. For instance, it can be directed towards vision, towards being with the body, towards the breath, towards a mantra, towards the transcendent sounds or nada. It can be oriented in lots of different ways. The thing that distinguishes this attitude, you might say, to practice is that you're seeking to attune to it as immediately as possible, a strong sensation of being complete now, being in your natural state. But we'll also, we'll return now to a discussion of some other forms of practice as well. Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. When we are learning to concentrate, which is the foundation of meditation, although we want to bring in as much as we can some of the quality of that we were exploring in this meditation, there's inevitably a need to have a mindful sense of the value of arriving at presence through the tool of concentration. In a sense, concentration isn't just some technique. It's really a process of centering. It's a process of coming home. It's a process of remembering. In a sense, when we become distracted, then we realize that, and then we remember, and that realizing, we're remembering and coming back again. So concentration is this word that we often use to describe the process of learning to keep remembering and coming home again. And eventually we reach a stage where we're concentrated enough that the quality of the meditation takes on new dimensions. It becomes more intuitive. It becomes more imbued with other qualities. And it eventually becomes more mystical, if you will, transcendental, non-dual, whatever your leaning is in the transcendent dimension. But at the foundational stage, which is very important not to try to skip over that. It's important to become adept at concentration, because it's the method through which we let go of identifying with our personalities and become centered in our truer nature. Come home again. So what do we mean by the personality then? And why do we want to disidentify from that? It's not because we're judging the personality in some condemning way, that we want to, get a little too heavy-handed with, or even harsh in our, but terms like ego or personality are often used to simply identify that aspect of our nature that's arises out of the experience of being a separate being, not an individual, but separate. Making a distinction there. If our sense of individuality is one in which we feel that we're alienated from the world, then we'll suffer as a result of that. So the essence, you could say that the essence of the cause of suffering is misunderstanding ourselves as separate beings. And our personality, our ego, is simply that point of view. It's that sum total of our experiences, our karma, our desires and thoughts and emotions and behavior patterns that have arisen out of the misunderstanding that we're separate beings. So when we're meditating, for instance, and this also is true in day-to-day life, the first step is to become clear about that difference, because in essence, what we're cultivating in spiritual awakening is we're shifting our identification, so to speak. We're arriving in a truer experience of our nature. And the first step of that is to distinguish between, we use these terms like contentment or devotion or surrender or love or compassion or awareness, mindfulness, concentration, to describe a dimension of our nature that's truer and that is freer of suffering, is freer of the experience of being a separate being. Now, there's an even more mystical, more profound level that's sort of the essence of these qualities. It's not different than them, but there's a way to go so deep into the essence of these spiritual qualities that we discover something radically transcendent about our nature. But the bridge to them is these qualities. The bridge to that state are these different spiritual qualities. So in a sense, what concentration is it's really just describing learning to concentrate is another way of talking about gaining clarity about the difference between our personality and our soul, and centering ourselves in the soul. And we actually do this moment to moment every time we, for instance, if we're meditating, if we set as a goal that being concentrated on, say, the breath, then when we become distracted, what that means is we've fallen back into identification with our personality. Distractions are experiences of being involved in our personality consciousness. And there's a variety of different forms of that. which we'll talk about in a moment. So concentration is really a way of describing the moment-to-moment process of cultivating a deepening clarification of the difference between the two and an ability to come back home, come back to resting in a state of deeper contentment and concentration and awareness and love and acceptance. So why do we keep getting distracted? Well, in a sense, it's very simple. We keep being kind of drawn back into unconsciously the habit of thinking our happiness is going to come from other things. So if we're sitting there meditating and suddenly we find that we're planning our dinner, it's because our personality desires of thinking our happiness will come from the meal are stronger in that moment than our awareness that there's a deeper happiness that comes from awakening to our true nature, to resting in our soul nature, if you will. So distraction, concentration, coming back. Concentration is learning to awaken moment to moment. It's just a term we use to describe the process where we're still on the stage of going back and forth, which is kind of the learning process, because in a sense, the going back and forth is part of the learning of the difference between the two. Come here, go there, come here, there. As our awareness gets more subtle, as our progress deepens in meditation, one of the things we'll notice is during distraction, we're likely more often to be a little more caught up in some drama. Like, for instance, if we're thinking about a conversation that just happened, or we're worried about an interview that's coming up later in the day or next day, there's often regret or worry, anxiety, fear, anger, resentment, other emotions that frequently come with some of these things that we're preoccupied with. So as we're meditating, over time, as we're deepening this ability, one of the things we'll notice is, wow, this centered place where when I come back home is much more calm and balanced and peaceful. And then when I get distracted, it tends to be more suffering in that. Now, some of the distractions aren't necessarily negative emotions or negative, things that we're afraid of or whatever. It can just be that we're caught up in fantasizing about something that we'd like to experience, or we're daydreaming and thinking about, it's like I said, a meal or something we're looking forward to. We're going to go on a vacation. And that's fine. And what we'll notice is that even those will, over time, will subtly develop this deepening appreciation for the fact that a lot of these activities are fine. They're part of life. It's not like we have to reject them in order to be on the spiritual path. But we'll also notice that there's some kind of deeper fulfillment that we're experiencing in our practice that comes from coming home, resting in our true nature. That ultimately is more profound than all of that. And at first, those things will still be attractive to us, and we'll get distracted by thinking about them because our wisdom hasn't developed strongly enough to see that difference. But as it does, and see the act, we call it concentration at the stage when it's sort of like a practice of training ourselves to do that. Eventually, it becomes effortless because we just know that being home is where we want to be. We don't have to concentrate anymore. We're just there. It's effortless. There's even a stage where in our ordinary lives, we still have desires, we still have a human personality, but we're far enough along in the process of awakening where when we sit down to meditate, our personality is kind of well trained at that point. It knows that it's best to just surrender. It's time to go home. And it's still even effortless then, because that part just says, okay, this is what we're doing now. I'm not going to rebel against that. And we all settle into a deeper state together in different parts of ourselves. So in a sense, concentration is simply what we call the process when we're kind of teaching ourselves about the difference and our personality still has a pull, and our consciousness keeps going that way, and then it comes back. And there's a lot of subtle stages to concentration. It's good to sort of learn that path in the sense that we can accomplish one substage of mastering concentration and move on to a subtler substage of concentration. And eventually, we'll have a very concentrated awareness. And two of the major things that result from that are the core effect of being more concentrated is that in that moment, we tend to be happier. I say tend to because two things can happen at the same time. That core part of us that has learned to be focused and present and concentrated and resting in this deeper, more centric place, that part will be more peaceful. But our personality may still be going through stuff. So we might actually still be haunted by some difficult emotions, for instance, that are just part of our life at that time. So we're kind of in this dual state where one part of us is more peaceful and centered, and another part is still, let's say, upset about something, or just generally sad, for instance. That doesn't mean that the meditation's not working, so to speak. It just means that there's things that need to heal and be transformed and illuminated, and gradually all that will work out. So in a sense, there's a kind of a type of awakening, a stage, even though, let's say, of awakening, where it's not so much that our whole personality is in bliss, is transformed, is filled with love and contentment. It's more that we've developed this core capacity to enter a deeply more contented, awake, and accepting state of consciousness. And that will coexist for a long time, actually, for most people, with parts of us that aren't in that state yet. And it will take a while for them to transform, to awaken, and sort of join us there. So we'll kind of differentiate into parts that have awakened, and then a core part of us that we're identifying with more and more that is deepening our capacity to enter this deeper state of presence. Now, at this stage of learning concentration, there's many different methods that can be used. And really the heart of the method, the difference is just different objects that you can concentrate on. The practice that we just did is a little more on it's basically based on the spirit of shikantaza. And what's challenging about that state is that true shikantaza doesn't rest on any particular object of concentration as we would normally understand it. There's no following the breath. There's no isolating some aspect of experience like the body or the mind to contemplate. There's no mantra or sound current or visualization, mandala or yantra or any of these things. The essence, spirit of shikantaza, which is very similar to Mahamudra or certain essential forms of Vipassana or Dzogchen, is that you are resting in a natural state in which you're uniformly open to anything arising on any level. So in a sense, that concentration is that which sustains that quality of presence, but it's not on anything in particular. So something arises in your awareness, like you hear the doorbell, you hear a car drive by, you feel a sensation in your body, an emotion passes by, or thought. You just are uniformly open to any type of phenomena arising. So that's actually a fairly advanced form of concentration. It's not as easy to learn that. So it's better generally to start with a form of concentration where you have something very specific like your breath or a mantra to focus on. And generally it's good to kind of maybe do some degree of experimenting, but ultimately to settle into some particular object so that your mind really gets an opportunity to be kind of trained to remember that object as the focus of concentration, and not there's a saying in I'm not sure where this saying comes. I think it might be a Hindu or Tibetan saying, if you dig too many wells, you won't hit water. And what that means is if you kind of scatter your practice amongst too many different forms of practice at the same time, where you've got 5 different practices. Some people can do that. Most people, that's digging too many wells at the same time. It's better to have a core practice that you use to just generally deepen with, like following the breath, or some type of visualization, or you might say a practice like the self-inquiry that's taught in Ramana Maharshi taught it. It's just also used in the Zen tradition and other places where you repeat an inquiry like, who am I? There's other versions of that I enjoy and have worked with very much myself. One that I've mentioned before that I like is, what is love? That's a very powerful practice. And if you just persist in that practice over a period of time, it's very transformative and deepening. So we'll come back to some of these practices in more detail soon. But the key idea I'm focusing on at the moment is just picking something that is appealing. It doesn't have to be interesting. Like, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that it's best if your meditation object is interesting to you. This can be fine as a way to get started with meditation, but ultimately, the thing that you're learning to find that's interesting is you, not the object of meditation. The object of meditation is often just a way to give you something to focus on so that you can practice coming back to being present and concentrated and awake. So if it's something as simple as the breath, some people will find the breath fascinating. In fact, everything that you could possibly think of can ultimately be something that is a doorway to deeper spiritual experience and understanding. So even if on a human superficial level, something like following the breath might seem boring or uninteresting, it will become interesting because everything reflects our true nature. Everything is a doorway to spiritual realities. And so one of the things that's particularly useful about having something very simple like a mantra or following your breath that's kind of on some level isn't that interesting, at least to start with, is that it's not about it. Concentration has the deepest value when it's not motivated by something like, this is an interesting object to concentrate on. Rather, it's the spirit of using concentration to get present, get centered, and experience the value of that. That you can feel content, loving, blissful, whatever the object of concentration is. It doesn't matter. Now, one of the useful notions that we find virtually in all spiritual teachings around the world is the notion of what could be called hindrances or obstructions or fetters. And this is really just a way of looking at the different parts of the ego, personality, and kind of break it down into different facets. As I said, the core of the ego is the misunderstanding that you're a separate being. From that arise 2 basic traits. Once we feel that we're separate, we feel a sense of need. And that need generally is dualistic in the sense that it's, since we feel lack, we feel that we're separate and we don't feel whole, then there's a sense of lack. And we can either understand spiritually that lack can be overcome by awakening to the truth of our nature, that we're not separate beings. Or we might think that that lack will be filled by something outside of ourselves. So those are the two basic paths, you might say, path of samsara and the path through nirvana. Within the path of samsara, if we're looking at our environment, what's outside of ourselves, and saying, well, my happiness lies out there somewhere, we're going to break the environment into two basic realities. Those things that we think will make us happy, and those things we need to avoid because they bring suffering. So two basic traits that arise out of the misunderstanding or ignorance of thinking of experiencing ourselves as separate beings are attraction and repulsion, or desire and aversion. So these three are what in Buddhism are called the three poisons sometimes, the three basic traits of the personality or the ego: ignorance of our true nature, desire, and aversion. And all of the other hindrances are just variations on those. But it's useful to recognize them in different forms because they can be disguised. They won't necessarily, they can be symptoms of those traits without necessarily. For instance, one hindrance is boredom. We might be meditating and then we get distracted by feeling bored. And a train of thought enters in, this isn't very interesting. I think I'd rather do something else. I'm getting a little bored. Maybe this isn't a good meditation. Maybe I'll just get up and do something else now. That boredom can be caused actually either by attachment or aversion. For instance, if we're attached to being kind of excited by or interested in or fulfilled by specific phenomena in our lives, like eating an interesting meal or playing a sport that we enjoy, then we're sitting there meditating, we feel bored because that part of our nature that has those desires finds meditation boring because it's not that interested and doesn't know how to experience intrinsic beingness, intrinsic wholeness and fulfillment, just being ourselves as we are. Doesn't experience that. So it says, I'm bored, and it tries, and that boredom is coming from a desire or a pattern of desires. Restlessness is the same way. Restlessness is a kind of energy that's saying, I need to flow my energy into looking for something that's more fulfilling than what's happening right now. Restlessness can also be aversion. If we sit and we just open to accepting reality as it is, old karma might come up that's uncomfortable from our subconscious. We might start, and we have an aversion to that. And so we become restless because subconsciously we can feel it coming up and we don't want to be with that. It's painful. We have an aversion. So we feel restless, and that's motivating us. Hey, we should stop meditating now, then we could avoid the suffering. So it's useful to have some categories that we're aware of, like ignorance or misunderstanding our true nature is the ultimate hindrance, and then all manner of desires and aversions, and we can make a huge list of all those, but you don't need to necessarily make that. I mean, it can be useful, and you will, as you meditate and progress on the path, you'll see them all. You'll start to notice, oh boy, I'm attached to reading again. Like, I love reading, and then the book that I just ordered isn't coming on time, and now I'm frustrated, and that's coming from your attachment to the book and the reading. Yes, there's value in reading, but we don't need to be attached to it. We can just be content and be okay with that the book's not going to come when we hoped it was going to come. So there's a long list of different kinds of desires, and we start to become familiar with the basic ones that our personality has. And aversions, things that upset us, things we're trying to avoid. And then a lot of the kind of effects like boredom and restlessness, heaviness and tiredness. Another very important hindrance is doubt. We may be in the midst of a practice and just start feeling disconnected from the value of it. Like, what am I doing? This isn't working, and I don't know if I believe in this. And that's a perfectly understandable thing. In a sense, if we were perfectly beyond doubt, we'd be self-realized. It's part of our nature, and even on the spiritual path, there's going to be residual doubt that's constantly subtly having an influence. So we have to make our peace with doubt, but at times it becomes such a present dimension of our experiences, say for instance when we're meditating, that it can interfere even to the point of getting us to stop meditating. So doubt is something to really be mindful of, is that as we gain more experience, it's important to be willing at a certain stage of the path to have a kind of experimental attitude where we say, okay, even when the things that the teachings say will happen, that we'll become more peaceful, we'll become more content, more loving, more accepting, that even during the stage when that's not happening as much as we'd like it to, I'm going to experiment and see if this process works, and that over time I have to give it some time. And so I'll suspend my doubt. I'll just suspend my concerns and my frustration and just give it time. And that helps us to disidentify, not become too drawn off track by doubt. So there's a wide variety of these hindrances. Question is, do I have any suggestions for increasing the desire to meditate? Well, yes. One useful thing to do as you, for instance, as you sit down to meditate, is to read something before you meditate. Or if you have some favorite, say, videos to watch online or something like that, to expose yourself to the Dharma, and especially to something that immediately for you reminds you of the value of meditation. So, for instance, if the core motivation for you, as it is for many, is just a deep awakening that comes with self-realization and a deep capacity to love. If in your own understanding you see a link between becoming a more loving person and persisting in your meditation practice, and then you read, say, a biography of a very saintly person, then that can translate right back into saying, you can get 2 pages into the book and say, oh, I love this, I gotta meditate. And then you put your book down and you go meditate. So a lot of time it's it's finding ways to remind yourself about the beauty of the Dharma. Whether it's, that's basically the value of what we're doing right here, of engaging with people who can transmit their enthusiasm for the path, people who you can share with other people, you have friends, you have a sense of sangha or community. That's to support your awakening as well, to support your desire to practice. Reading about it, encountering, like I said, you can even do things like bring up videos about anything that reminds you. Another very useful thing to do to strengthen the inclination to meditate is to make it a very specific ritual part of your day. In other words, the same way that you brush your teeth before you go to bed at night, to the point where that's such a habit that you wouldn't think of not doing that. You eat at a certain time of the day. Depending on the person, let's say you eat 3 meals a day, and you kind of know if you skip a meal, it doesn't work so well for you. And a lot of times, for instance, most of us are experience a relationship to eating where it's like, well, a certain time of the day comes and we just know it's time to eat dinner. It's best if meditation is the same way, that there's a specific time of the day, at least, of course, one. Sometimes people prefer more. When you cultivate the habit, the ritual of that, that's the time for meditation. It's that moment that you've isolated, that you've identified that is where meditation is going to happen. And then when that's the case, once that becomes more of a habit, it also has this power of its own where what that time of the day starts to come around and you just start feeling like more like meditating, because that's what happens. Another thing to do too is if you find yourself kind of wobbling in your practice, feeling like, oh, I'm a little less inclined to meditate right now. One strategy is to kind of make a contract with yourself and say, well, look, I usually meditate for 45 minutes. What if I just meditate for 10 minutes? You know, you're kind of negotiating with the part of you that's losing interest or kind of rebelling against the practice. And you say, look, because what happens is very often once we sit, we quickly remember why we like it. And then it goes longer than the 10 minutes. But if we contract with ourselves, well, we only need to do it for 10 minutes. If you really want to get up after 10 minutes, that's fine. But let's just sit for those 10 minutes, and then we'll see what happens. And then that's enough to get over that little hump, and we find ourselves motivated to meditate longer. So that's kind of more from the strategy, side of the. And also, of course, even though this is part of, the general idea of just exposure to the Dharma, very much kind of attuning to the type of literature and teachings that specifically talk about meditation and the value of meditation can be a powerful way to motivate oneself to meditate. You kind of have to remember, like, why am I doing this? This is why it's important to acknowledge the relative side of the path, because for most of us, for some part of the path, the inspiration to meditate is going to be because we see it to some extent not just as satisfying in the moment, but also a means to a deeper state farther down the road. We have to recollect that. We have to recollect our aspiration for that. So in a certain sense, this is one of the most challenging parts of the path, is that I remember talking to a spiritual master back in the 80s who I visited in New York. And he said that the bulk of his path was awakening that spark, that fire of wanting to practice and in people, and then helping to keep it alive so that most of his students needed constant support in keeping it alive. And that's just the nature of this world. If you look at the society that we live in as a whole is actually kind of telling us, don't meditate. This is how to be happy. You should have these values. We're kind of inundated with, it's in our genes, it's in our own incarnational history, it's in our families, it's in the world around us. We're getting another message. Oh, meditation's silly, or why are you doing that? That's trying to tune into something that's not even real. You're misguided, you're just navel gazing. And instead, and even when it's not an actual attack on the Dharma, it's often takes the form of just and ignoring it in a sort of immersion in an orientation to life that's primarily about seeking happiness in other ways. So that's part of the challenge, that why so few people are embracing the Dharma. There's millions of people around the world that are, but that's out of billions of people. It's still a minority of people that are passionately interested in the Dharma. And so those people one of the basic challenges those people face is how to keep that spark alive, how to keep this flame of aspiration to meditate and practice and stay awake, so to speak, going. And so what the Buddha taught was that there were three main refuges, three main realities that will support your interest in the Dharma: the teachings themselves, the Dharma, the Buddha, and the Sangha. The Buddha as the sort of primary inspiration of the lineage, the Sangha. In fact, at one point, the Buddha apparently said that in some ways the Sangha is the most important of them all. Even more so than the Buddha, your primary daily source of support and transmission is often the community that you're part of. Now, not everybody gets to have all of these pieces. A lot of us live in places where there isn't availability of Sangha. That's one of the things that's kind of wonderful about the internet, is that you can create a Sangha that's worldwide without, without the expense of traveling and all of that. So that's wonderful. So Sangha and the Buddha and the Dharma. That's basically, participating in these is generally the basic foundation of keeping that motivation to practice alive. I see a question from Tamara, but before I take that, let me just ask Hans, do you, let's see, unmute. Is there any follow-up to that, that question?
No, not really. I think you gave a very good answer. Thank you.
Sure.
I do have another one though, but maybe you want to Tamara's.
Let's see. Does it fit into the flow of that what we were just talking about, or is it just on another subject?
Yeah.
I think Tamara was just making a contribution to the four thoughts that turn the mind towards the Dharma. Yeah, one of the things that you can do is contemplate specifically ideas that help. For instance, one of the thoughts is to reflect on the preciousness. You know how I was talking earlier in this talk today about how precious a human birth is. It's a special opportunity for enlightenment. To reflect on that idea. That's part of the reason that I shared the idea, is to kind of underscore the idea that this is a wonderful opportunity for awakening to have a human body. It's actually a form of grace, a form of love from super intelligent beings, great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and archangels that cooperate to create an environment where we can have these human bodies as a vehicle for awakening. So reflecting on ideas like that, reflecting on the impermanence of life and the sort of inevitability of suffering and dukkha. These are some of the other ideas that are powerful to do specific things like that, it can help kind of like stoke our aspiration, strengthen our desire to awaken. So Hans Christian, what was your next question?
Yeah, it was about you talked about time, and that was very interesting. How the meeting of a master, for example, or a teaching, and the inspiration to take significant steps on the path will actually speed up time, or rather speed up the time before we come to the point of the end of the goal. But I was thinking that, in the daily routines or the daily life, there seems to be the opposite effect, that time passes so fast and it's difficult to get get everything done, and particularly in a mindful way. So maybe I'm answering my question myself, but do you have any suggestions how to slow down time so that actually we somehow get things done and still have time for example, meditation, maybe even a significant amount of meditation without feeling that, you know, we have to sacrifice too much of family life, duties, and so forth?
Well, that's a big question. Let me take a piece of that for now. Concentration is a very profound part of that. In a sense, without getting into sort of the esoteric, that kind of statement about time that I made, probably not hard to see how that's a pretty esoteric idea. And to really kind of try to get that intuitively more deeply, we either meditate more and or preferably both. We could talk about it more at another time. But on a more practical level, concentration has the effect in our day-to-day lives of not just keeping us centered when it's spiritually centered or inspired concentration, but it makes our day-to-day activity more efficient too. We get more accomplished. Inspiring story that I learned about a master that I learned Shabd Yoga from, Saint Darshan Singh, Sikh master from India. Of course, he was very adept in that tradition, became a guru, started meditation practice at the age of 6. And so he entered into a career as a deputy secretary in the Indian government, which he retired from about 62. And because of his spiritual practice and his state of consciousness, he was so concentrated in a very relaxed and peaceful way, not a tense, busy concentration, very effortlessly serene, focused awareness, that he was able to get through his daily duties at work in about 3 hours. And then he spent the rest of the day just being available in his office, and people would come by and ask for guidance. And he became a kind of spiritual guru, counselor at his job. And then when he retired, they had to hire 2 people to get the work done that he was doing in 3 hours each day. So it's that practical too, that concentration, really in a sense gives you more time, you might say. So is that enough for now on that?
Yeah, sure. But it would be great if you could take up that theme of time again later.
Sure. That's we'll find an opportunity for that, definitely, sooner rather than later. There was a question. Let's see. Okay. Okay. So Liv has said, yes. So you said you didn't understand that. What didn't you understand, Liv? Is Liv still here? There she is.
I just mean that the only thing that makes me want to meditate is that I long for God.
Mm.
So that's
Right.
yeah, that's the only thing that's the only reason why I do it, and it's just that longing. I think if you have if you feel that you don't feel like meditating, maybe looking inside and connecting to that longing that I think that all souls have at all times until you are totally liberated. Then I think you want to sit down when you connect to that longing, because it, like you say, is the only thing that can fulfill you and give you what you really need. So So if you don't feel that longing, then you are maybe too much into all these false avenues that are filling you up too much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's ways that people can also work kind of skillfully in their day-to-day lives to kind of increase that longing. It also differs. Some people think of it as, or feel it as, a longing for union with God. Others want to know the truth, or they want to cultivate, and it's a way in which all these are just different ways of talking about the same thing, but there's different things kind of inspire, different versions inspire some people more than others. And so in a sense, part of what we're involved in as we grow into the spiritual path and deepen the path is how to awaken that aspiration and how to strengthen it and keep it alive, because that's the motivation. That's the core motivation of awakening, is that longing, whatever form it takes. I agree. Lars has a question, it looks like. Do you have a question, Lars? Why don't we come back to that? I don't hear you, no. Let me see if you're not muted. How about if we come back to you in a second, Lars? No, I still don't hear you. How about we take Johnny's question first then?
Okay. This is concerning that. The core of the ego and the personality is this misunderstanding that it's separate. And I was quite interested in if you could elaborate that about the misunderstanding, because is it a misunderstanding where it's a flaw, or is it just a general misunderstanding that creates life, the physical life?
So, if I understand the question, you're saying, what's the nature of this misunderstanding? Is it just a flaw, or
is it intentional? Is it a flaw, or is it intentional? Because you call it a misunderstanding, and a misunderstanding could be something that just could have been corrected by evolution, maybe, or whatever.
Yeah, it's not my experience that it's intentional, because my experience is that the basic misunderstanding at the heart of the separate self is this sensation of separation. This experience of oneself as separate is not a given. It really is a deep felt understanding that isn't the truth. It isn't the way things really are. And it leads to suffering, and so I don't feel that beings would intentionally choose that. I think, though, that I have a sense of maybe where you're going with this, and this could get more involved. But to keep it short for the moment, there's an issue of, in a sense, you could say, at the heart of the whole experience of samsara, which is the Hindu Buddhist term for a dimension of experience where the beings experience themselves as being separate, and they have desires, and they're motivated to seek experiences, and they're constantly learning. And eventually, in a sense, you could say, through both natural evolution and through an increasingly sort of intelligent or guided or a self-aware process. Beings come to the realization, they figure out, you might say, that if they're mistaken, if they're not separate beings, they never were. It's in the same way that, say, modern science is, through all kinds of different points of view, like physics and ecology, is pointing to the fact that we can pick up an object, we can look at a plant and say, well, that's a thing in and of itself. But then science actually points to the fact that none of these things really exist in a vacuum, even at a very basic level of matter and energy. There's fields and particles, it's all interconnected. There's no actual separation there. So when we experience ourselves as separate, it's a misunderstanding. It's a false view. And it turns out that our suffering arises out of that misunderstanding. So that's my basic sense of that. Was there something else about that you were exploring in your question?
Well, yes. Maybe I can. You say it leads to suffering to believe that you are separate. And so, are you supposed to avoid that suffering? Because are you saying that suffering has no point, has no value, and doesn't do it any good? Is that what you're saying then?
I see. Yeah, this is what I was hinting at earlier, that I suspect there's some place you're going with it. Is it kind of questioning then the whole, like, so why are we here? What's the purpose of, say, our being a human being or our spiritual evolution? Why is there, like, did the suffering have a purpose in the end, for instance? Is that part of what you're getting at, that kind of question?
Yes, because that's the whole point of having an ego, right? That is that misunderstanding. So it must be some kind of deliberate misunderstanding. It's necessary to get experience being and
yes, I see what you're getting at.
That's that way.
It's a very important and good question. It's kind of a big topic, which I'd like to address. We're already about 20 minutes over, so I'm thinking maybe we should hold that to the next time, and we can jump right in with that. I'm going to actually make a note about that too, so unfortunately, I think I'll hold that till next time, and just move towards winding up now.
Yes,
Okay, now I think Lars might be back. If it's a quick question, Lars, we can try to take that now. If not,
I'll try to make it. Do you hear me now?
Yes, definitely can.
Okay. I was thinking if you could distinguish between concentration and presence, because it struck me that if I try to concentrate by on a subject or a thing or a thought or counting or something, I don't find it very easy to concentrate. But if I say to myself, now I'm just going to be present, then I find it easy to concentrate.
So say the first one again.
If I'm basically doing selective concentration, it feels like my level of concentration easily drops. Like if I, especially with closed eyes, and for instance, I say, okay, I will just count, for instance, or just follow the breath. Then I'm kind of getting more and more dull. But if I say to myself, I just want to be very present, then I kind of keep my concentration up. So is there any useful distinguish between difference between concentration and presence?
Yes and no. In one sense, there there isn't. In one sense, you could just say concentration is a doorway to becoming more present. But there's more to it than all of that. And so another thing that I would add briefly is that both ends of that spectrum of selective, focused concentration and a kind of more open presence are both important to cultivate ultimately. And it's likely that you find one easier than the other because that's your nature, like that side of that difference comes easier to you. But ultimately you would find that cultivating the other actually does balance your overall development and opens up a doorway to other aspects of your spiritual development, and actually will be something that can be very important part of even deepen the state of presence itself in that more open way. So actually it's a very important question. There's some key issues that brings up, and we'll come back to that further as well in the future.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you all for coming. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.